in our recording right before we get to anything critical, so that's wonderful. And before we actually dive in, I'm going to pass over to my interpreter colleagues to walk us through how to access the different language channels.
Thank you so much, Katie. I will first give these instructions in Spanish and then in English. Buenos días, buenas tardes. Este seminario web se va a llevar a cabo en inglés y tenemos interpretación simultánea al español con Marvel Language Services, y esto es para el principio de justicia lingüística que WEDO está comprometidas. Entonces vamos a compartir esto en el chat, pero también los vamos a decir. Si tienen algún problema, avísennos por el chat. Para activar la interpretación de Zoom, por favor hagan clic en el globo terráqueo que dice interpretación. Está ubicado abajo a la derecha en su pantalla y escojan el español en este caso. Si están conectándose por su teléfono móvil, hay 3 puntos, están ubicados abajo, dicen More, opriman ahí y luego, básicamente, opriman español y luego toquen Done arriba a la derecha. Ahora, si tienen algún problema, déjenos saber y por el chat, a mí, Flavia, o a María Angélica. Muchas gracias. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Now, in order to honor WEDO's commitment to language justice, this webinar will be in English with simultaneous Spanish interpretation. If you would like to listen in Spanish at this time, please select your language. This is located at the bottom, the lower right side of your screen. Choose the language. In this case, it would be Spanish if you want to listen in Spanish, and then you will hear us. If you are connected from a mobile phone, this is located at the bottom right. There are 3 dots that say more. Click there and then choose Spanish, and then you'll be able to listen to us. If you have any issues connected, do let us know through the chat. And a friendly reminder to all speakers to please pace yourselves. Thank you so much. That's all.
Thank you so much, Flavia. All right, wonderful. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for choosing to spend this next hour with us, or if you're watching the recording later, that you've decided to tune in. My name is Mara. I am a program coordinator at the Women's Environment Development Organization, or WEDO for short. And WEDO is a 30-year-old global advocacy organization working at the intersection of gender, environment, and climate. And my work has really focused on trying to build out some more resources on gender and climate policy in the US in particular. WEDO really comes into our work knowing that we understand the root causes of the climate and biodiversity crises to be capitalism, extraction, imperialism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. And that when we're talking about feminist solutions and feminist analyses, we're really talking about full systems change, challenging the fundamental logic of exploitation and domination and greed that we know has enabled environmental degradation, and building instead systems that are centered on care, regeneration, racial, gender, and economic justice. So in 2022, WEDO released our first brief in this policy brief series, and it was focused on transport, climate, and gender, really honing in on what a feminist analysis of transportation reveals to us. How are racism and patriarchy baked into the design of the US transportation system, shaping things like who has access to public transportation, whose safety and affordability are most considered, how it's not designed for caregivers who are predominantly women, and what feminist transportation advocates are pushing for already in practice and in policy. Now, we're excited to be releasing the second in that series, focused on a second sector, energy. This system that powers so much around us and is critical for powering our schools, hospitals, homes, and our lives, and is also responsible for 3/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. We know we cannot confront the climate crisis without transforming our energy system, dismantling a fossil fuel-based privatized energy system built on extraction and pollution, and building something new and different in its place. We know for generations, Black and Indigenous communities and other communities of color and low-income communities have spearheaded visions of energy justice that position and honor energy as a human right, not something that you have to pay to access, that is made possible by the exploitation of resources and the labor of some for the benefit of others. We know deep and thoughtful processes of consent, consultation, and prioritization of communities most impacted by the current violences of our energy system are required to transition to an energy system that is accessible, affordable, and grounded in human rights and gender justice. While some may stop at drawing a difference between fossil fuel-based energy and renewable or green energy, it's really important to remember that a transition to renewable energy is not inevitably just and fair. The potential and the current reality of exploitation of land and labor and violations of consent to advance renewable energy must also be resisted. There cannot be an energy transition for the benefit of some at the detriment of others. As the world's largest historical greenhouse gas emitter, the US plays a particularly harmful role in perpetuating energy injustice in the US and abroad. We at WEDO know that global energy justice will require a really powerful intersectional energy justice movement in the US, one that demands and encompasses systemic change to US policy that impacts the lives and well-being of all those around the world, in addition to those in the US. So we're offering this brief and this webinar conversation focused on advancing a more feminist analysis of energy justice in the US as one small contribution to a really robust and powerful and existing movement towards a global feminist energy just transition. We know additional dedicated work on many of the global dimensions, in particular on critical minerals mining and global trade systems, are so important to US energy policy. And those are next avenues of work for us organizationally as they sit a bit outside the smaller scope of this brief. If you're working on some of these issues, please be in touch with us. We're really eager to build out these resources around global justice and US energy policy more deeply. So last housekeeping rules, we will be recording this call for the folks who are busy during this time and won't be able to watch live, but want to join us at some point in the future. So look out for a recording of this. And we will have a bit of time allocated at the end towards question and answer. And in this webinar format, you can access the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Okay, with all of that, I'd love to pass over to Sanjana. I have had the pleasure of working with Sanjana on this brief for the last few months, as she really brought together some of the existing research on energy and gender to create this top-line resource for folks who are looking to learn more. Sanjana Paul is an engineer and environmental educator and researcher focusing on renewable energy systems, as well as the co-founder and executive director of Earth Hacks, an environmental hackathon organization. She authored this brief and has a lot to teach us. Sanjana, I'd love to pass to you to share a few of your thoughts on the brief that folks may be interested in diving into as soon as it's launched after this. Why is energy such a needed site for transformation? What are some of the ways that gender considerations have to shape energy policy and planning? What do you really hope that folks leave the brief thinking about? The floor is yours, Sanjana.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Mara, and thank you so much everyone for being here today. I'm really excited to share some of the insights from this report that really addresses one of the most pressing issues of our time, which I think, of course, at a high level is climate change, and then thinking specifically is this intersection of energy justice, of feminism, and really the urgent need for systemic transformation in how we approach energy policy. So I think that this report, hopefully, is more than just an academic exploration of energy systems and really serves as kind of a place of education and a call to action. I hope it really challenges us to rethink the foundations of our energy systems, which, as Mara mentioned, have really been built on extraction, colonialism, and the perpetration of environmental injustice. Our goal can't be to simply replace fossil fuels with renewable energy, but to fundamentally transform the way that energy is produced, fundamentally transform how energy is governed, and how it's distributed. So I hope that this report is one step of many towards building new feminist, human rights-based energy systems. So I think the intention behind this report is kind of twofold. The first is to really broaden the conversation around energy justice and to center those who have been most impacted by the current system. Communities of color, low-income communities, Indigenous peoples, and especially women within many of these communities have really borne the brunt of energy injustice, whether it's through the placement of harmful infrastructure, whether it's through dealing with rising energy costs, or exclusion from decision-making processes. So one goal is to really present a clear and feminist framework for achieving energy justice that's rooted in human rights and deeply inclusive of gender, race, and class-based inequalities in the analysis. And so energy justice, as we define it here, is really about ensuring equitable access to energy resources, not just energy itself, but also about addressing the broader harms caused by our current energy system. So it's about intergenerational justice, protecting the environment that we live in and that we're dependent upon for our survival, and ensuring that the benefits of energy transitions actually reach everyone. And so this report hopefully doesn't just stop at a general sort of call for justice, it explicitly focuses actually on feminism as a key lens. And so why feminism in particular? Because energy transitions, like all major social transformations, it won't impact everyone equally. So women, and particularly women of color and Indigenous women, often face heightened risks, whether it's from climate impacts or from the very processes involved in producing what we talk about as clean energy. So using a feminist lens allows us to critically examine these intersecting inequalities and really move towards ensuring our energy policies uplift people rather than continue to bake in the cycle of marginalization. So some of the key recommendations that we're really hoping to put forth from this report, one is just starting with acknowledgement, is really just starting with embedding, gender, race, and class analyses and the notion of justice into every level of energy policy, rather than kind of treating it as a nice to have or kind of an add-on if we meet our original goals. Another recommendation to kind of make this first one happen as well is trying to ensure that women, gender diverse individuals, and marginalized communities who have been actively excluded from decision-making processes are now at the forefront of these processes as we move forward into the future. We really also recommend prioritizing community-led initiatives, publicly owned initiatives, and decentralized energy systems as alternatives to kind of current corporate dominance of how we govern our energy structures and access energy. And finally, we recommend that we implement targeted policies that address energy cost burdens, particularly in low-income households, many of which are headed by women. So transformation, as we envision it, is not simply a technical shift to renewable energy. It's really about reimagining and reshaping energy systems to be very equitable, to be very community-driven, and to actually be grounded in human dignity. A feminist and just energy transition will prioritize care, it will prioritize well-being, and it will prioritize global sustainability over kind of these short-term harmful goals of profit without acknowledging the fallout from that and extraction. It really challenges us to see energy not necessarily as a commodity, but very much as a human right in the 21st century and very essential to have a thriving community. And so I hope that people take this report as an invitation and take it as an invitation to really imagine what could become and what could be possible. A world where energy systems don't just meet physical needs, but actually contribute to broader societal transformation. I hope it's about, building a system where everyone has access to energy, where no one is left behind, and where we fundamentally challenge and collaboratively dismantle these structures that perpetuate inequality. So this brief is going to walk us through gender considerations in energy policy, primarily in the US, but with a little bit of a foray into some international efforts, including decision-making practices, including accessibility, affordability, health and safety, as well as touching on topics like gendered employment barriers, policy recommendations, and case studies of two phenomenal organizations who are doing really, really great work at this intersection already. So my hope is that this report is going to serve as a guide and as a resource for policymakers, for activists, and for community leaders who are really committed to enabling justice. Not just environmental justice, but justice in the truest and in the most intersectional sense. I think that at this moment in time, we really have the opportunity to reshape our future, to ensure that this energy transition that we must undertake to fight global climate change actually really benefits all of us and serves more of humanity, especially those of us who have been most marginalized by the current system. And I think it's up to all of us to make that transformation a reality. So I'm very excited to get into a bit more discussion around some of these themes today. And just once again, want to thank everyone for being here. Mara, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Sanjana. It's been an absolute pleasure learning from you as you've written this brief. And I'm just so excited for other folks to get to dive into it and learn from it and start conversations and follow up with questions. And yeah, really just so much appreciation for all that you've offered in this brief. And also right now getting to hear you speak about its core takeaways and lessons learned. So thank you again for your work on this and for setting the scene for the rest of our conversation. So I'm excited to turn next to our panel, a panel of 4 different advocates and activists who are all working on energy in the US in different ways and with different perspectives, coming into the question of what is a more feminist energy just system, from so much rich expertise and experience, from campaigns to advocacy to organizing work and policy efforts. We're going to get some insights into visions of what a more just energy system that really challenges power norms looks like. So I will turn first to Gabby. Gabby Sadi Tobar is an energy justice campaigner at the Center for Biological Diversity, where she works to advance a just and equitable transition to 100% renewable, democratic, and distributed energy across the country. Gabby, can you tell us a little bit more about your work to be transforming who holds power within energy systems? How does ideas of community ownership and challenging power shape your work to build local and national campaigns? Over to you, Gabby.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, and really excited about this panel and this amazing policy brief. So as Mara mentioned, I work at the Center for Biological Diversity as a campaigner in our energy justice program. And our program is really focused on both dismantling systems that keep us tied to a fossil fueled and extractive energy system, while at the same time working to advance a renewable, resilient, affordable, and equitable energy future for all people. And to get at your question, I first kind of want to talk a little bit about the energy system we have and why it's in dire need of transformation. So right now we have all these massive profit-driven utility companies who are really built to serve multimillionaire executives and their shareholders and the fossil fuel status quo. And they're the ones calling the shots. And despite being charged with providing a public good like energy, their decisions are burdening communities, especially communities of color and low income, with dirty air and water, skyrocketing energy bills, and utility shutoffs. And so to kind of put this into perspective, I want to kind of hone in on one specific campaign that the center has been working on really since the start of the COVID pandemic, which is around utility shutoffs. So at the start of the COVID pandemic, the Center, Food and Water Watch, Free Press Action, and various organizations across the country were campaigning around a moratorium on utility shutoffs. This was in direct response to utilities who were inhumanely cutting off people from life-saving utilities like electricity, water, and broadband. So everyone was being told you have to stay home to stay safe and stop the spread of COVID, yet people were living in unlivable conditions at home. So from 2020 to 2022, we actually found that utilities shut off energy service to families about 5.7 million times. And nearly 90% of those shutoffs could have been prevented with just 1% of what major utilities rewarded their shareholders. And a study from Duke Energy actually showed that had there been a utility shutoff moratorium in place since the start of the pandemic, it would have actually prevented 15% of COVID deaths. So I think the shutoffs crisis, specifically during the COVID pandemic, really showed a number of things. One, that access to utilities like energy is a human right. These are life-saving services. And two, that utilities are prioritizing their bottom line over the health and safety of communities. And so while we have made it out of the pandemic, the utility shutoff crisis persists, and it continues to send families into debt and energy poverty. So this summer of extreme heat, I think, has really put a spotlight on this and just shows how dire the situation can be. We need electricity to keep the AC running to survive extreme heat, to keep medicine cool, to power medical devices or even air filtration systems that keep toxic wildfire smoke out of our homes. And yet energy remains unaffordable and inaccessible for far too many people. So the average US electric bill this summer is projected to be $719, and that's an 8% increase from the year before. And so families are being forced to cut back or even forego basic needs to keep the lights on. And I think that's just a stark reminder of how broken our system is. These are sacrifices that no one should have to make, especially when utilities are profiting hand over foot. And so while jacking up costs and shutting off families from their power, utilities are also fueling the climate emergency. They're standing in the way of real solutions like community-centered renewable energy, like rooftop solar with battery storage, community-owned solar systems. These are power systems that are resilient to climate disasters, and they also bring tremendous community benefits, from jobs to lowering energy bills to helping to bring the power back to people versus piling it on to these very powerful utilities. And just a little plug here for something that some might not know, but utility companies are actually using our money through our utility bills to lobby and litigate against policies that expand cost-saving renewable energy solutions. There's a concerted effort right now by utilities to undermine net energy metering programs. They really kicked it off in California, but these are key programs that open up access to these community owned and centered energy systems. So it's pretty clear profit-driven utilities are standing in the way of climate action, and they're undermining energy justice. And so we have to totally revolutionize the way we produce power so it isn't just a commodity that big corporations can profit off of. And so this energy future has to be affordable, resilient, renewable, and community-centered and democratic. It has to empower communities that have borne the brunt of dirty pollution and centralized monopoly power. And so that framework and that vision is really what is the bedrock of the center's campaigns. And that's really what guides the work that we're doing. And so we're committed to advancing these community-centered democratic energy systems like rooftop solar with battery storage and microgrids, energy efficiency. These are systems that keep the lights on when disaster strikes, helps lower costs for families, and again, puts the power back in the hands of people versus monopoly utilities. And just to kind of give a brief example of what that looks like, the center has actually been engaging in Puerto Rico around, post-Hurricane Maria and post-Hurricane Fiona, which totally decimated the energy system on the archipelago, leaving people with extremely high energy bills without power for months. That caused a huge public health crisis. And FEMA, the Federal Energy Management Agency, emergency management agency, has actually allocated billions, like a historic amount of money, to rebuild the grid. And instead of actually using that money to build a resilient energy system, they are putting it back into building the fossil fuel status quo. And so we've sued FEMA over this, and we continue to challenge them for what they're doing to, re-embed all this money into fossil fuels, which are facilitating these, intense and disastrous climate disasters, but also which are keeping communities tied to a system that harms them and stands in the way of achieving energy justice. And so there's lots of other work that's happening around this across the country in terms of outlining a new vision for what our energy future can look like by prioritizing community-owned energy. But I'll leave it there just to not go on for too long.
Thank you so much, Gabby. I mean, I could hear you talk about this for many hours more. Thank you so much for grounding us in some of CVD's analysis and work around this. And I'm taking so much away from your reminders around seeing utility shutoffs as one site of such stark violence, and how models of community ownership are really challenging the corporate greed that is so inherent in today's energy system, and moving us towards this vision of energy as a right and as something that is accessible to all, and that these pockets of creating that world are everywhere and are existing and are being practiced and being built. Thank you so much, Gabby. I also, before moving to the next panelist, I realized I should have said this at the beginning. I'm so sorry, but in our follow-up with folks who are attending the webinar, we will share all of these incredible panelists' organizations and work so that you can continue to follow their campaigns and plug in and support. So if you were listening to Gabby and wanting to learn more about CBD's work around utility shutoffs, don't fret, you'll get the information to follow that more closely after this webinar. Thanks again, Gabby. So I'll move next to Brianna. Brianna Carvajal is the State Legislative Manager at We Act for Environmental Justice. They are responsible for working directly with state legislators and agencies to build programs and policies that advance environmental justice for the Northern Manhattan community and other environmental justice communities across New York. I'd love to ask you, Brianna, how is WEAC's work and energy advocacy shaped by feminist analysis in your opinion? How does this look like, and what is it reflected like in your work in communities and with communities in New York? Over to you, Brianna.
Thanks, Mara, and thanks to all the other wonderful panelists that are on the call. Just in this short amount of time we spent together, I feel like I've learned so much and feel really grounded in why we're here today in this space. I wanted to start off a little bit about, if you haven't heard of We Act before, what is We Act? We Act is We Act for Environmental Justice. We're a community-based organization. We've been around for 35 plus years with membership all over Northern Manhattan, including Harlem, Washington Heights, Inwood. We also have a national arm in DC where we continue to do federal policy advocacy. My position is, like Mara stated, working in New York State specific focus and working with New York communities and our membership that are part of the act since our founding. And we really prioritize the needs of our community members, which looks like folks living in lower income communities, folks of color, and when talking about energy justice, a lot of those themes that we've already talked about today do arise, particularly with women being head of the household in lower income communities. And with energy justice, you have to also talk about housing justice. And so I'm going to talk about the intersections of that today, and particularly in New York City, where majority of folks living are renters. You know, what does protecting tenants and fighting gentrification to keep people in their homes look like? And I'll get started with one really amazing study we did. I think it was last year or 2 years ago, but you can read all about it in our report, Out of Gas and with Justice. I'm sure it'll be shared with you after this webinar. But essentially, we took over the course of 10 months, we did an air monitoring study that measured indoor exposure to nitrogen dioxide alongside participant satisfaction in apartments that we transitioned from gas to electric induction stoves. The study was really the first of its kind to focus on the effects of residential cooking electrification with tenants in place in a public housing setting. So this pilot took place in the Bronx and was done with a building that was publicly owned by NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority. And some of the results of this were pretty groundbreaking. After switching out gas stoves for induction stoves, which are electric and amazing to cook with, we registered a 35% drop in nitrogen dioxide emissions. And during some of the testing registered that when people were cooking with gas stoves, there was levels of nitrogen dioxide that exceeded even the EPA's outdoor air pollution standards. And so indoors, we were seeing air pollution measures that were even unsafe for when you're outside for unhealthy and sensitive groups. Nitrogen dioxide is associated with a lot of health concerns, particularly relating to asthma and lung damage. And so it's particularly dangerous, and only gas stoves emit nitrogen dioxide as a pollutant. So this study taught us a lot about how we really need to be paying attention to indoor air quality, and there need to be regulations around indoor air quality and standards in the future. But we also, in doing this pilot, we underscored the importance of dedicated funding and resources to low-income communities to address unique housing challenges they face when it comes to building electrification. That includes health and safety, weatherization assistance, utility bill assistance, etc. And so this was just kind of like a groundbreaking first pass in what the future of energy justice should look like for when we're looking at indoors and what we should be looking at, and to really address the underlying barriers to even get people in this, transition to cleaner energy and this future we envision where we're not breathing polluted air. We do need to think about how we get old buildings that multifamily housing, multifamilies are living in. How do we get them from being this having environmental hazards in their home like lead, mold, asbestos? Maybe there's a leaky roof, maybe there's some structural damage, to a place where we can even think about electrification. And so at the state level, we're thinking about advocating for a fund of sorts that might be like $200 million to start us on that path of beginning to get rid of making homes healthy. And that way we're also improving air quality, we're improving their heating and cooling systems, we're improving the comfortability of people being in homes, and we'll also likely reduce energy bills. If we're improving efficiency, if we're reducing leaky windows that have a lot of air coming through them at night, we're going to be reducing people's energy bills by default. So it all comes together in this really comprehensive way, while also thinking about tenant protection. So once we fix up these buildings, how do we keep them in the home? We don't want landlords to raise rent. So when thinking about all of these policies that impact people's housing conditions, keeping them in the home should be also a number one priority. And so I think I'll pause there or stop there, and I'm happy to take any more questions afterwards, but I'll pass it back to you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Brianna. I feel like you're really helping me understand some of these connections between community-driven research and data driving community organizing and campaigns and subsequent legislation, and how critical it really is to ensure that campaigns are grounded locally and are driven by community needs in order to shape policy at the city, state, and then even national level in terms of the lessons learned. And I think also really drawing some clear connections for me around tenants organizing and thinking about the home as like a site of such clear struggle around energy justice, but also housing justice, gender justice, racial justice. Thank you so much. I'll turn next to you, Irene, and bring in a bit of this labor aspect that we've been touching on. 30 years ago, Irene Hong-Ping Shen was in the first AmeriCorps cohort, making low-income housing more energy efficient. And after working with environmental justice organizations and workers' centers since then, in 2016, she joined the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, a project housed at the City University of New York, School of Labor and Urban Studies. I'd love to ask you, Irene, what role does a strong labor movement play in energy systems transformation? Can you tell us a bit more about your work ensuring women's leadership and access to good energy jobs as part of this just energy transition? The floor is yours, Irene. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Mara. Can everybody hear me? I was having some trouble with my headset.
I can hear you well.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. Let's see. So yes, my name is Irene Hong-Ping Shen, and I'm the lead organizer and coordinator of the Women's Leadership for Public Energy Initiative, for Public Pathway Initiative at Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, which is also known as TUED. And I want to thank you, Mara, and WEDO for the invitation today to speak. I'm glad to be here and really look forward to hearing more and discussing in a little bit, and also reading the brief soon. And I just want to thank the interpreters for doing their job and being here also. So to answer your questions, I think I'm going to be speaking from a lens of what TUED calls a public pathway, and I need to give a little bit of background context for that. So our project TUED is a global network of 126 union bodies from 47 countries, many from the global south. And it's the largest international trade union project working specifically on climate change and energy policy. The network itself emerged after the Rio+20 climate talks in 2012, when Global South unions called for an alternative to the green growth model of addressing climate change. And today, 12 years later, TUED does research and works with unions on the ground to influence energy and climate policy and to promote the public ownership and democratic control over the energy sector. Our project is critical of neoliberal pro-market energy policies that have dominated climate discussions and are the mainstream policies that people respond to when they talk about how to address decarbonization. Our arguments are not just ideological, but they're researched facts that show privately owned renewable energy companies, for example, wind and solar, do not actually attract investors because in a free market system, renewable energy does not guarantee returns. Instead, public money must be used to subsidize these private renewable energy companies so that their investors can make a profit. This dynamic also slows the building of wind and solar projects, and as a result, we are nowhere close to meeting the growing global demand for energy with renewable power. So these policies are not only limiting in terms of an energy transition, but they are also regressive. And the working poor and the working class are the ones that really feel the financial burden of these policies and feel the hardest hit. And as others have mentioned already in their comments, women are vulnerable in this space of financial burdens, and women make up the majority in these constituencies with lower paid wages, with unpaid care work and reproductive labor, making the issues of affordability and access key to women's struggles against neoliberal policies. In contrast, the TUID analysis shows that the public ownership and democratic control of the energy sector is actually a plausible solution to the climate crisis while also supporting progressive politics. Energy is the backbone of the global economy, and if you are saying that the energy sector needs to be publicly owned, then ultimately you're challenging capitalism. And as many of the listeners here probably know, the exploitation of women and reproductive labor has always underpinned class societies and are the earliest forms of exploitation under capitalism. So the public ownership of energy as a framework aligns with a feminist approach to the energy transition. Through this lens, a key feminist priority in the energy transition is one that opposes neoliberal energy policies and the actors in those policies, such as private energy companies, also known as independent power producers or IPPs. But we know that just because something is public does not mean that it actually serves or is accountable to the public. We've already heard today comments about how the state can be violent or oppressive and repressive. So the element of democratic participation and control over energy is essential. So we call this whole package the public pathway. And you can find a more detailed outline of what that is in something called the Trade Union Program for a Low Carbon Energy Future, which is on our website, and I can also drop the link in. And it actually illuminates the need to reclaim and restore utilities, to decommodify electricity and demarketize energy companies by repealing laws and regulations that support the privatization of the energy sector. And because, it's been raised a few times already here, I think I should add that, US energy policies are essentially based in neoliberal approaches where subsidies are provided to private renewable energy companies to help facilitate the transition to cleaner energy. And these policies have forced community energy projects to into money-making models of energy. And we are hands down in support of anti-oppressive, transformative energy transition, but also, more broadly, transformative practices and general journey of transformation in society. But I think we really need to recognize that the community energy projects as they currently exist, framed within neoliberal energy policies, are actually not liberatory projects. And we would, I think, I'll speak for myself, but, support community energy as a transitory space for people to engage with energy issues in. But I think the challenge that emerges is that from an organizing perspective, if communities then become dug into and think that community energy projects under neoliberal frameworks and policies are actually the transition and the space we need to occupy for true transformation of liberation, I think that is something I wouldn't agree with, and something that I think I would love to have comradely discussions about in this space or other spaces, because I think it's an issue that's been floating around for a long time, and we haven't really had the room to have those discussions. So just back to your question, Mara, I think in terms of a role that a strong labor movement could play is that one that supports and embraces and promotes the public pathway, and that this movement of unions and allies actually exists and is growing because the public pathway resonates with them. They've seen the negative impact of privatization on both workers and also consumers. And the public pathway offers an honest class-based analysis of a way forward for a just energy transition. The public pathway isn't beholden to making profit, which means that it can create the conditions that allow for planning and coordination, which are absolutely essential elements in a global energy transition. The public pathway allows for the prioritization of ecological and human needs, which, obviously fighting for feminist priorities falls under that kind of planning. While we will need to struggle for feminist priorities to be articulated and met in the public pathway framework, it's these conditions exactly that also provide the potential to actually advance feminist priorities in the energy transition. And in terms of ensuring women's leadership and access to good energy jobs, one of these feminist priorities must be about workplace gender equity and the intentional development of women leaders in their sectors. Increasing women's employment in the very male-dominated energy sector in particular must include extra support, training, and leadership development, and plans to account for women's caregiving schedules, among many other things. So the public pathway discourse is emerging as TUID works with unions in multiple regions, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia Pacific, Latin America, and we are working on developing it. Simultaneously, we are working with female trade unionists in the Women's Leadership Project for a public pathway to develop feminist priorities for the framework, so that one day when we say public pathway, everyone understands that at its core is a feminist approach to a global just energy transition. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Irene. Wow, I think it's been made very clear that if we don't have a strong labor movement that is coming from energy workers, energy unions, and is incorporating that strong human rights feminist analysis to bring us towards a public pathway, we won't be pursuing a just transition that truly serves us all. So thank you so much, Irene. I also see some questions in the chat as well around following up on some of the things mentioned. So I encourage panelists, if you haven't already, check those out and see if any are directed at you. Thanks so much, Irene. Lastly, but certainly not least, I'm going to turn to Ilka. Ilka Vega identifies as a transfronterista from the US-Mexico borderlands and serves as the executive for economic and environmental justice for United Women in Faith. She's worked for over 14 years on human rights and justice issues, including the intersections of climate, migration, gender, and racial justice. I'd love to ask you, Ilka, how does an ethic of care shape how you think about organizing women, femmes, feminists, caregivers, and beyond for energy justice? How does that ethic of care sort of come in? Over to you, Ilka. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mara, again for the invitation, and everyone that has already spoken and those present here. I'm happy to be joining you today from Rarámuri lands of the Mozachic in Mexico right now. And just being very thankful for everything that has already been said and shared. I'm really holding it as sacred space and something that is very fulfilling to learn about the work of my colleagues. And I guess what I want to share about the ethic of curse when it comes to our work is that it really comes from a place of caring for one another and caring for all of our siblings in creation, under the understanding that we're all interconnected, but most importantly, that we're all interdependent in this web of life, right? And under the lens of our faith tradition, since United Women in Faith mostly organizes with other women of faith, but also in other groups and spaces, the understanding that we're all related also as part of God's beloved creation. And this is a philosophy, the ethics of care is a philosophy and practice that resonates, and I think it's also further articulated under a feminist ideology, but really resonates with a lot of feminist groups, a lot of environmental justice groups, a lot of faith traditions as well. And so I think it's a great place to start when you want to bring people together, because we all have something that we care for, right? And so this interconnectedness, I think there's both humility and agency in it. Knowing that we're not less, we're not more, we're we are in relationship, and we all have a part to play, right? That's very important. And we recognize that in our work, like our foremothers did in United Women in Faith already over 150 years ago, since 1869, that women of all ages, children, youth, femmes, people in caregiving roles, people in situations of vulnerability, such as migrants, low-income communities, historically marginalized groups such as people of color in the global South, while disproportionately affected by the systems of injustice. We're not just victims, but we're creators of change. We have agency. We're powerful beings. And we bring about change better when we can bring our full selves. And that's by having an intersectional approach also, that it's so important, that we don't think we have to leave any of our identities behind, any of our struggles behind, or our histories, or think that we have to compromise on them to work for change, but rather we need them. And we need to work on intersectional justice, like Sanjana was saying earlier, if we want to really move towards a more just and beloved community. And so we embrace that agency. We try to embrace that creative power in our full embodiments through our Just Energy for All campaign, and work with almost 500,000 members that United Women in Faith has across the US and the world to demand systemic change that work for us and the communities we love, but especially for those that have for so long been left behind. And not just change the social structures, but really work for transformative change of the hearts and minds that guide our decisions, that guide the systems of power and economies that we're part of. So we engage with womanist and mujerista theologies as well to guide us and to be in conversation with. And so what does that look like? Well, we emphasize through our Just Energy for All campaign that we have an urgency to address the climate crisis by, yes, reducing our emissions, certainly transitioning into renewable and equitable energy system. But in order to do so, we have to move at the speed of justice. And we emphasize that this transition cannot continue doing business as usual. And like Mara said, it's also not guaranteed. It requires work and it requires larger systemic change in our economies and in our ways of life. And this transition cannot be made at the expense of communities, like it has happened over and over again. We cannot continue also the fallacy of infinite growth. And really we have to, like an ethics of care will call us, we really need to transition to an economy of enough, where we provide and gather rather than exploit and extract, where we can care for creation rather than think we can dominate it, where we fix our relationships with one another and really build up just relationships and understand our roles as stewards from that humble perspective. So a truly just transition for those at home and abroad that centers human rights, that centers human dignity, and that centers just relationships. So that's the vision we want. And for that, we want to equip ourselves with education. So we do teachings and webinars, and we invite others to speak. But we also want to recognize that we're experts in our own contexts and communities. And so we also create spaces to listen to one another and work together through working groups and different spaces to hear from what each other has to share from their own context. And we take the streets and we work locally, state, and nationally as well to advance justice issues and work intersectionally. And we share resources with one another, not just top down, but horizontally, really from each other's context and expertise. And we intentionally work on centering the voices of those directly impacted. And of course, we believe that transformative change is needed and actually can happen anywhere from places of worship to the streets to places of power. And that's why we have to come together, drove by our values of care and organize, and understanding that we're our own liberators and in community and in relationship with one another.
Wow, thank you so much, Ilka. I kind of just want to end the webinar right there because I feel like that was such a powerful way and final sort of set of ideas to leave us with. And I think you're really leaving us with this key message of envisioning an energy transformation that is rooted in care for each other, care for the planet, care for all beings, and really what would that offer us? Thank you so much, Ilka. I appreciate how all of the panelists are also, I think, demonstrating how many avenues for transformation folks are pursuing, organizing through faith constituencies, through labor unions, through building neighborhood power in specific communities like Northern Manhattan. I think there's this beautiful thing about energy justice organizing. That means since we all have a need and a stake in energy justice, there are so many constituencies, communities, identities, and structures through which we can facilitate that kind of envisioning together. It's really happening everywhere. And thank you for demonstrating such a broad sort of set of examples of that for us, folks. So with that, we've reached the end of our panel's interventions. And I'm so grateful for you all for sharing even just a brief set of ideas for us and sharing this time. I want to call attention to some of the questions that are in the chat. If you haven't been on a webinar before on Zoom, you'll see there's some open questions that are in the first tab, and then there's answered questions that, of course, still are likely to have more ideas that some folks may want to add. And I'll just make a last call as well for if there are any more questions in the audience, please feel free to add them. But I'll just let our panelists see those and ruminate on them for a moment if there are ones you haven't already gotten the chance to answer. And I'd love to just go around one last time and, using moderator's privilege, add my own question as well. And ask you to actually indulge us in one last exercise. This is something that I think many of my teachers and mentors have left me with, the idea that, you know, to be able to envision what we are building, what we're moving towards, we really have to be able to describe and paint that picture of what we are moving towards, what we are building together, and exercising that muscle together. So I'd love to ask if folks have like 30 seconds, really describe for us. You are all building towards a more just and feminist energy system in different ways, as we've gotten to hear about. Can you describe to us, when you envision what that world with more just energy systems looks like, what do you see? What do you feel? What do you hear? What does your morning commute look like? What do all of the daily activities that you know you enjoy, how are they different? Give us one small sort of example or window into like what that world looks like. Help us paint that picture. And very briefly, because I know we're reaching the top of the hour, and thank you to everyone who's able to stay a little minute extra or two, and we'll of course be recording for folks who want to tune in later. Is there anyone who'd like to go first? Maybe we can go. Oh, I see Sanjana coming off mute. Over to you, Sanjana.
Yeah, I'm happy to get it started. I really appreciate that because I think it is, helpful to think about what we're moving towards in addition to what we're moving away from. And the sentence that I use to orient myself all the time, like at least once a week, I say this to myself, is working towards a world with more human and planetary thriving. So thinking about how we both power our homes and schools and also do that without giving kids asthma from air pollution from energy sources, which is such a bare minimum thing. It's actually very embarrassing we haven't accomplished that so far. So thinking about overcoming those barriers to a world with more human and planetary thriving is what I use to orient myself in this work.
Thanks, Sanjana. Maybe we can go in the same order we spoke in. So Gabby, over to you next.
Yeah, no, this is a really great exercise. I think, just kind of tying it back to the shutoffs issue, a world where people don't have to make sacrifices over just basic necessities like keeping the power on, putting food on the table. And then with that too, a world where like we have solar panels on rooftops. And people can generate the power that they use, and see their bills go down.
Thanks, Gabby. Over to you, Brianna.
Yeah, I think it looks like walkable cities, mutual care, clean air, affordability, a thriving community culture, and a wealth of green spaces is my ideal.
Incredible. Thanks, Brianna. Over to you, Irene.
I love this question. So much to say, but I think people would be smiling more. There'd be less noise pollution and air pollution when we walk around in cities. People would be more human to each other, kinder, more generous. I guess it would be the opposite of destruction. Thriving. I like the word thriving that a lot of people have used already. There's so much to say, but yeah. just it would be healing.
Thank you, Irene. Wow. Ilka, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I think I envision it as a journey we're already in. I think justice and energy justice is not going to be just a destination, but the journey itself. And we're hopefully working to be on that already. So the vision is that we're making collective decisions together, that we're not leaving anyone behind, that we're humble also to learn from nature and the life-sustaining systems that are there, that are the best at energy efficiency, including how they use the sunlight already and how everything is powered through that. That we work for Indigenous people's sovereignty, and we learn from their ways and wisdoms of being in the world. That we take just the energy we need and we feel connected to others when we do that. So we think about it from its source to its delivery, globally, locally, and that we do so in an economy and a political world that we know has care at its center, not greed or exploitative growth, and that we hopefully stop seeing our siblings in creation or one another as commodities, but rather as true siblings, true family, and we allow ourselves to, why not, also spend more time offline, disconnected, but spend more time connected to each other, nurturing each other through these relationships.
Thank you so much, Ilka. Wow. I see Susanna in the chat saying, not a question, but a loud affirmation. Y'all are absolutely fabulous. And I echo that, and I echo a deep, deep appreciation for all 5 of you for being here and sharing some of your wisdom and experiences and lessons learned around the campaigning and advocacy and policy work that you're doing right now and that you continue to do and that you teach us to do better as well. Thank you to our interpreters for being here and supporting language justice in this space. Thank you to the audience for being here and for hanging on a couple extra minutes. I'm going to go ahead and leave in the chat the just launched brief on gender and energy that folks may be interested in diving into, and then coming to Sanjana with all of their questions afterwards. No, I'm kidding. But truly, if folks are interested in following up, please do. I will be emailing all of the attendees with my email address, and I am happy to check in and chat more and be in conversation about not only what some of the initial offerings in this brief are, but also the conversation that just got us started in this webinar. And we will also be sharing the organizations and the work and names of all of the incredible advocates you've just gotten to hear on this webinar, so that you can follow more of TUID's work, of United Women in Faith's work, of We Act's work, of CBD's work, and engage and support and plug into their ongoing energy justice work in all of the diverse and beautiful ways that it is taking shape and taking form. So last thank you from me. Really appreciate everyone's time and energy and attention being here. And let's continue the conversation. Thank you all for helping us paint a picture of the world we are moving towards that is towards a more feminist, energy justice system. And let's get to work. Let's keep building it. Appreciate you all.
Thanks, Mara. And everybody, bye.